Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
We jump into the time machine for Throwback Thursday, and this week we celebrate the 47th anniversary of one of the most unique and crazy events in sports history. In fact, that event took place right here in Houston at the Astrodome. It was titled the Battle of the Sexes and pitted former male pro tennis player Bobby Riggs against a current female tennis player at the time, Billie Jean King, who everybody knows by now was just a pioneer in the sport and is considered one of the greats of the game today. 3 years ago, I caught up with then Chronicle sports reporter Dale Robertson, who covered so many tennis Grand Slams over the years. One of the first big events a very young Dale Robertson covered was the Battle of the Sexes in the Astrodome. Right before we had that conversation, Robertson wrote about how the actual event compared to the movie based on the story Battle of the Sexes, which had just been released. The semi-biographical film starred Emma Stone, Sarah Silverman, and Steve Carell. So I asked Robertson about the movie, as well as get his thoughts on the best tennis players of all time. By the way, my conversation with Robertson took place in the NRG Stadium media room, just 100 yards from the Astrodome itself. So very apropos. Well, without further ado, let's jump into the time machine and catch up with Dale Robertson.
Live from the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, the tennis battle of the sexes, Billie Jean King versus Bobby Riggs. What a scene it is, the Houston Astrodome, where up till now they've played almost every sport in the world except tennis.
What do you remember about that day?
Well, it was crazy. It was, I was obviously a very, very young sports writer. I had never seen a tennis match live in my life, had never played tennis, never been around tennis. I was aware of tennis because of television, but showing up there, I thought, this is a really strange sport. But it was fun. It was, you kind of had to know Houston back in that era to understand how it fit in perfectly. We were a place of spectacles. We had Portuguese bullfighting. We had heavyweight championship fights. We had crazy, weird track meets, all staged because the Astrodome was a fascinating place. We have to remember when this tennis match was played, the Astrodome was only 8 years old and was still a big deal. It was the obvious place to play this thing. What we'll never know is if had Bobby Riggs beaten Billie Jean, the story was that he already had a contract to play Chris Evert, and would he have played Chris Evert at the Astrodome Tour, they've gone someplace else. But the reality is there was no venue like the Astrodome for something like this, and to this day it was still the largest attendance for a tennis match ever in the United States. A little over 30,000.
People don't remember he had already played Margaret Court, the number one player in the world. He had challenged her, but the Billie Jean King with Bobby Riggs became bigger than life because of Bobby Riggs, and he was the constant showman. And just, there was so much that he did to build up that event, and the two of them did to build up that event. And Billie Jean King was in an interesting situation because if people don't know, that was right when Title IX had just passed. She had just worked on getting women's tennis becoming a professional tour, a women's professional tour. Is that right?
The previous year at the U.S. Open, she became the first woman to win $100,000 in a sports event. The movie makes a big deal about that, and I'm sure Bob, you have to understand something. Bobby Riggs at that point in his life had been basically living, the great irony is the great chauvinist was basically a kept man because he was living with a very wealthy heiress who frankly had thrown him out. And there's a scene in the movie where he's sleeping in his Rolls Royce, which he won in a game in a game of chance. I'm not sure that ever happened, but Bobby was not well to do, so it was a big deal. But he understood the commercial potential of this thing. What a lot of folks don't realize is that the timeline in the movie is a little screwed up. We can talk about that in a moment if you want. But Margaret Court was the number one player at the time only because Billie Jean was having knee problems, and she hadn't played particularly well of late. So Bobby really had no choice but to play Margaret Court first because she was number one. You don't play number two. But Margaret Court had the absolute worst temperament, the worst constitution for something like this. She wasn't a show person. Billie Jean, at heart was also a she understood show business, and she was much tougher mentally than Margaret Court. So it was a convergence of things that came together. The Astrodome and the timing of the event was also perfect, because Virginia Slims of Houston tournament, only the third one ever played here, was scheduled for what is now Jim McIngvale's West Side Tennis and Fitness. But at the time it had just opened, it was called Net Set Racket Club. And that was going on that week, so she was going to be in Houston. So she actually had to juggle her schedule in the regular tournament to make this happen. But truthfully, in understanding everything that goes into a spectacle like this, the Astrodome was the only place it could have been played.
Remind people why Houston was important for Billie Jean King at the time, because I think you wrote in your piece just a couple of years before that, something really important happened. They made it out in California, as you said. Explain what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, what they do with the movie is, and I understand why you do it, because you don't want to get bogged down in something that's not important to keeping the plot moving. And when you see the film, you're going to think that the 9 women, Billie Jean being among them, met with a woman named Gladys Hellman, and they each accepted a symbolic $1 bill and became professionals, and were immediately thrown out of the United States Lawn Tennis Association. At the time, women's tennis was an appendage to men's tournament. There were no separate men's and women's tournaments. Wherever there was a tournament, the women played on the outside courts. They might get on the main court for the final, something like that, but they were tied together. Well, tennis turned professional in 1968, and by 1970, there was starting to be a little bit of real money coming into regular tournaments, not just the majors. Jack Kramer, the former U.S. champion, was basically the godfather of American tennis, and he was very much a misogynist, and he was certainly a chauvinist. And it came to a head in 1970 when the Pacific Southwest Championships, which was probably the second most important tennis tournament in the country behind the U.S. Nationals, which had become the U.S. Open, he offered the women 1/8 the prize money that he was going to give the men. And Billie Jean, and with her friend Gladys Hellman, friend and mentor, certainly on the business side, Gladys Hellman, who was living in Houston at the time, they said not only no, but hell no. So they held a press conference in September of 1970, about 3 years before the Kings-Riggs match, where they announced that they were separating from the USTLA. They were going to be a professional circuit on their own. The 9 women accepted the $1 bill, but it happened here in Houston at the Houston Racket Club, which itself was only a couple of years old at the time. You won't see that in the film. In the movie, you're going to think you think they're doing it out in L.A., but it happened here.
I want to ask you about the movie in just a second and what the portrayal was like and what you thought of it, but let me ask you about the actual event itself. And they portray, there's a pig involved.
But they got the pig wrong. It was a brown pig, not a white pig, which you'll see in the movie. It's a brown pig. I remember this vividly.
So I guess Billie Jean presented Bobby with a pig as her chauvinist pig, if you don't get the reference there. And then you also have Billie Jean King is carried out by a bunch of guys on her shoulder, and these guys, from what I understand, were Rice University co-eds.
Well, it's funny. I didn't know that. Here I was. I got an email from my editor this morning asking if there's any way to find out who the 4 Rice track guys were, and I always thought they were just local models. They were obviously quote unquote hunks. I mean, it was a spectacle. It was not serious tennis, and obviously people did not change the world, but it was a whole lot of fun.
It was kind of like she was Cleopatra, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
They were bringing her out.
Exactly. Of course, he actually was paid a tidy sum by the sugar daddy company to actually play in a sugar daddy warm up, which he kept on for about 2 or 3 games, which you'll see in the movie, but. Once he understood that Billie Jean was not going to be Margaret Court and roll over for him, he was getting a little hot out here. So the jacket got removed, and never did find out if he actually got the full sum for only wearing it for 2 or 3 games. But yeah, it was, face it, it was Hollywood 100% right here in Houston, Texas.
And Billie Jean King talked about the fact that she actually came to the Astrodome ahead of time just so she knew when she got here which entrance to take, and she kind of knew her way around because. This was a huge. The Astrodome at that time was such a big.
Well, it was an unusual venue. Nobody there. The Louisiana Superdome was barely coming out of the ground at the time. The Astrodome was a unique structure in the entire planet for 10 years. And it was, it was a big deal, and imagine how intimidating the surroundings would have been for anybody who allowed them to be intimidated. But understand something about Billie Jean. She had, she'd won the U.S. Open, made $100,000. Now understand she won 2 years earlier. She actually pulled out of the Open, retired from the '73 Open because she was sick with the flu. And there was much concern that she wasn't going to be able to answer the bell here in Houston, and obviously a lot of money was at stake. Not to get too digressy here, but she also almost pulled out the day before when she found out that that Jack Kramer, her arch enemy, was going to be the commentator. She said he doesn't like women's tennis, he doesn't respect us. I will not play if he's on part of the broadcast. And ABC buckled and pulled him, and ended up being Rosie Casals, who was one of King's playing partners and buddies, and Howard Cosell.
Let me ask you about a young Dale Robertson, and did you realize...
I don't remember him. I have to think on that one.
Do you remember at that time thinking, Billie Jean, look at this. She's sort of caught between a rock and a hard place on this thing, because if she accepts the match, and Bobby Riggs at the time is a guy in his 50s. There's nothing she can win by beating a guy in his 50s, but yet if she doesn't accept the challenge, she looks like, oh, I'm afraid of doing something like this, especially after Margaret Court. Did you think about that when you were watching this?
Well, I probably didn't have a good enough perspective because I didn't have the long view then. I thought, thought it was a bit of a kind of the whole thing was a bit of a joke. But I did grasp, because I understood sports, that's how I ended up doing this for my livelihood, the kind of pressure she had to have been under, because nobody ever wants to play a no-win anything, and that's kind of where she was. And she wasn't playing just for herself. She was not, and she wasn't even just playing for the tour that year. She was playing for the future of women's professional tennis in the world, in her opinion, because in 1973 we didn't know where it was going to go. Nobody had any idea. So there was a tremendous amount of pressure on her, but it also speaks to, there was never any doubt how tough she was. She just was a tough cookie, and she was no nonsense. She wasn't funny. That's why she was somewhat a little bit ill-suited for this. Although having said that, she wasn't nearly as bad as Margaret Court, who was just totally out of her element. Billie Jean got with the program a little bit, but she was 100% business for this match. Riggs wasn't. Obviously, after beating Margaret Court as handily as he had, he was certain he was going to win, and win fairly easily, although he knew that Billie Jean was a whole different kind of customer. And, of course, we also, there have been stories that Riggs actually threw the match to settle a gambling debt with the mob. Well, nobody can say for certain, but I will say this. There are also stories that say that he had on the table a contract for the Chris Evert match. And understand, Chrissy was the future of American tennis and not Billie Jean. Billie Jean was 29. Chrissy was the sweet young thing, the cute kid. It was clear she was going to be the next great player. And so if Bobby plays her, the stories were that was going to be $1 million winner-take-all match. Now, $1 million is pretty serious money. Bobby Riggs was not that far in debt to anybody. This was a different time. Today you can be $1 million in debt to a gambler. Then he wasn't. So I don't think he threw the match. I think he played his butt off.
What struck you about meeting Billie Jean at that time? Because you talked to her right after that match, right?
Well, what struck me was, of course, I was kind of I was part of the press corps a couple of days before the tournament, the actual match and the match itself. I was just part of the press conference, but I was dispatched out to the net set the next day to talk to Billie Jean, and that was cool because she was an utterly spent force, but she could not have been more gracious and more expansive. And, my memory is that I talked to her for 30 or 40 minutes privately. Now, that may be just delusional. I don't know. But that's my recollection. But what I do remember leaving that day thinking, I'm going to love this profession, because if there are any more Billie Jeans out there, this is cool. Because she answered the bell on a competitive level. She was good people. She saw the long view. She was on the side of right in terms of social issues. Just the whole package. And frankly, she has remained, I can't say a close friend, but she is somebody that when we cross paths, I don't see her a lot anymore because I don't travel internationally and covering tennis. But when I see her, it's always a warm embrace, and it's cool to watch her evolve as a person. And it's not for nothing is the Billie Jean, the National Tennis Center where the U.S. Open played, called the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center.
And an underrated person as far as courage goes.
Oh,
in the
God,
history of
off
sports.
the charts. Off the charts. Just an amazing athlete, amazing woman. You know, when I look back on my years in the business, I mean, she's right there. She's on Mount Rushmore.
What did you think of the movie? Do you feel like it did a nice job of portraying it for the most part? I'm sure there, as you said, there's some things that wasn't accurate, but overall.
Yeah, well, the only quibble I have with it, and the only reason I even made a deal out of it, is because I was writing it from a Houston perspective, and I want Houston to get in the proper place in the narrative. The film's actually, it's hard for me to separate myself from the film and say this is a really great movie, because my perspective is such that I was predisposed to enjoy every minute of it because I knew the story so well. I think it's a really good movie. I think if you don't know anything about it, I think you'll enjoy it. But then we start looking for other things to criticize. Okay, the tennis itself comes off beautifully. They used a couple of body doubles. Vince Spadea is Bobby Riggs on the court. Spadea played here in Houston for many years. The tennis looks real, and that's important in a sports movie. We all, nothing frustrates us more than to see bads. And tennis, for some reason, is always filmed badly in movies. But when you're watching the match, you're kind of seeing what you were seeing. They recreated that. The story is honest in that it presents both Billie Jean and Bobby Riggs in nuanced ways. It's very easy to call Riggs just an awful guy, but he wasn't. He was just a guy trying to make a living. I mean, he had no money. Understand something about Bobby Riggs. He became famous in tennis when he won 2 U.S. Nationals in Wimbledon, but he won them right in the late 30s. Then what happened? World War II started. He had to go into the Army. He comes out. He's missed the 5 best years of his athletic career. There's no money in tennis. He could have gone. Had there been, he could have gone back and played and made some money. But at this point, he's yesterday's news. So he's of no marketable value on the barnstorming tour. So from that point forward, he had to become a hustler, and it culminated in what happened here. So he was not a bad guy. He was a very likable guy, and he was a clown, but he was a clown for a reason. So yeah, I think the movie gets it about as well as it could have gotten it, and it's the casting's good. One of my very, very favorite characters, Sarah Silverman, plays Gladys Hellman. Gladys Hellman was a hugely important person in the history of women's tennis and a hugely important person in Houston. And she did become a dear friend, and we stayed close for many, many years.
How big a part did this play in your life, because you have become such a huge tennis fan to this day?
It is ironic. There wasn't a direct line between my covering that. That basically got sent out there because I was a kid reporter who, I was sparable. I wasn't covering I wasn't covering like the Oilers or the Astros. So I said, kid, you're going to go do this.
This was the first tennis match you
I'd ever seen. Yeah. I mean, really. And believe me, I didn't. I literally was assigned to cover a tennis match for the first time 4 years later, and they actually had to go talk to a tennis player just to get some stuff explained to me. But it is ironic because I became known as like Mr. Tennis in Houston. I covered 30 U.S. Opens. I covered 25 Wimbledons, 14 French Opens. But I can't say that it all started with that match. But I always chuckle about the fact that where I was on the tennis spectrum of knowledge when I came out here to the Astrodome in September of 1973 to how it all played out.
Let me ask you this, just as far as the game of tennis as it stands right now, and maybe it relates a little bit to what happened with Billie Jean and women's tennis compared to men's tennis. I heard recently, I can't remember which tennis player said this, but they said there's no reason why women's tennis and men's tennis shouldn't play the same number of games per match. At best, they said that it should be maybe best for men 2 out of 3 instead of 3 out of 5, instead of moving the women up to 3 out of 5, because for one thing, I think maybe there's no point in doing 3 out of 5 for men. The matches are too long. It's not necessary. You're wearing down players and causing them to have maybe shorter careers. They're not going to play in as many tournaments because of the wear and tear that it takes. Do you have a feeling on that?
All of what you said makes perfectly logical sense, but then the counterpoint is that Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer have had longer careers than any great player in history. And truthfully, because today the men only play best 3 of 5 in the 4 slams. I mean, all the other they don't play any other matches that are other than 2 out of 3. I think tennis can become tedious, so there's an argument for making it shorter. There's certainly no reason to ask the women to play more than they play. The matches were it's fine. There's good geometry there. I think the guys themselves like the challenge of 4 times a year, having to dig down a little deeper, and because the tournaments are spread over 2 weeks, there's some rest time, and there is a certain majesty to watching one of those finals go on for 4.5, 5 hours. It really is. The single greatest match I ever saw and covered was my last Wimbledon in 2008 when Nadal beat Federer, and it just falling down, shaking your head. What an amazing athletic spectacle match! It was also delayed by rain and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't. If you play 2 out of 3, you're probably not going to get those plot twists and turns that you get from when you get into that 5th set and no tiebreaker, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I'm okay with the way things are. Right? There were times when I was cussing it when I was trying to get to dinner, but but I think it's great. I think just as much as we enjoy sudden death in the Super Bowl, it's kind of the same thing.
Let me ask you about just Serena. Everybody can agree on that she's the incomparable best female tennis player of all time. Who do you feel like is the best male? Where do you put the top 3? Federer, Nadal, Pete Sampras.
Well, the things we get into, of course, trying to compare, in any sport, athletes from different generations, a lot of factors go into it. I've always said that I would put the best players of every generation. I'd love to see them all be 26 years old at the prime of their careers and then play a tournament. Then we'd find out. Also using the same equipment. I think we have no choice but to proclaim Serena the greatest. She's certainly the physically strongest, but I don't know if she was better than Steffi Graf in 1988. I don't know if she was better than Billie Jean in 1971. I don't know that because we'll never see them play. Obviously, training methods, the money has also made it infinitesimally easier for a Serena Williams or a Roger Federer to pick their tournaments, to train. They don't have to worry about life. They have entourages. They're being taken care of because they can afford to have massage therapists. The way I always ultimately end this conversation is Rod Laver, who would certainly be in that draw. If everybody plays at their prime, Rod Laver would be in that mix. Rod Laver won the Grand Slam in 1962. He won all 4 major championships. Okay. Then he had to turn professional because he had to make a living. 16 years later, he's now a professional. He comes back in 1969, and he wins the Grand Slam again. Did not play a single professional tournament a single major Grand Slam championship from 1963 and through early 1968. None. Do the math. He missed, 40, 50 tournaments. But he still ranks like 8th or 9th on the all-time list of Grand Slam champions because he won 8 in those 2 years. How many would he have won? Tennis records mean nothing for that reason, and you can't. And equipment is so dramatically different that they play a different game. Anyway, I digress here. I asked Rod, okay, and this is talking to Laver 15 years ago. He doesn't have Federer on his radar screen quite yet, but he certainly has Pete Sampras. I says, "Who's the greatest player you've ever seen?" He looked at me, didn't blink, and I'm thinking he might say himself. He said, "Lou Hode." I went, Lou Hode? I'll bet most people listening right now have never heard that name.
I haven't heard it.
If you're a tennis guy, you understand who Lou Hode was. Same thing. Great Australian champion in the late 40s. As soon as he won a tournament, a title that allowed him to capitalize financially, he was out of here. He was done. He barnstormed for the next 15 years. In fact, when he played Laver for the first time on the barnstorming tour, he beat Laver like 27 out of 30 matches. So, of course, Laver's going to say that. So, who's to say Lou Hode's not the greatest player that ever lived? Yeah, of the modern era, I'm just on the strength of consistency and everything. I've got to go with Federer, but it's a tough call, almost an impossible call, and you can easily get talked out of it for the obvious reason is that Rafael Nadal has dominated that rivalry. So how is this guy a better player when this other player has beaten him 2/3 of the time? If Rafa doesn't go through a period of knee injuries, I think he's probably neck and neck with Roger. And ultimately, I think if you're really being honest and you look at it from that perspective, you've probably got to give the nod to Rafa. But again, his titles are all skewed towards the French Open. He's got 10 of those. So Federer's were more spread out, but he only won 1 French Open. So this conversation could go on for the next 3 hours without any resolution.
Yeah, and I remember I think there was somebody that was trying to get another battle of the sexes going between Serena. I'm trying to remember who they were talking about with her. So that this thing never seems to end. Everybody remembers the Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, but there's been these throughout the generations.
Oh no, yeah, I think Connors played Martina and with a different size court and all that. At the end of the day, I mean, understand something that this did nothing to change society. It was a lot of fun. I mean, it's pretty obvious in the times we're living in right now that the issues that were, bedeviling women in 1973 are still bedeviling women. So it didn't change that, but it was great. It was certainly great fun for a 21-year-old sports writer.
That was the recently retired 40-plus year veteran of the Houston Post and Chronicle, Dale Robertson. Can't even imagine what it was like to cover that event as a young sports writer. Hope you enjoyed our Throwback Thursday, looking back at the Battle of the Sexes. Don't forget to go back into our archives and find more classic Throwback Thursday conversations.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Don't forget to follow Houston Sports Talk on Facebook and Twitter. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, the Google Podcast app, or the Stitcher app. You can support us by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or by telling your friends about us. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.